So I get a lot of questions about the topping EHA5 because it is a new estat amplifier that is low cost. So it could be a really good gateway. It's hard for me to find a balance between thumbs up or thumbs down and or giving like way too much information. So this video hopefully tries to talk about the different aspects of amplifiers and what you should be looking for. Based on my life experience so far, I do believe in the idea that if the amplifier is powerful enough, has a flat frequency response, and has sufficiently low distortion, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference between amp A and amp B in a double-blind study when the volumes are calibrated so that they're at the same levels and things like that. So that is kind of my belief. Hitting those power levels and distortion levels is not that difficult based on today's technology with the traditional amplifiers, but with estat amplifiers it is actually pretty tough, and that's why there's so many, that's why they're so big and expensive and things like that, because you're not talking tens of volts, you're talking about hundreds of volts. So hitting those low distortion numbers and really getting a flat frequency response, even where you have sufficient output in the high frequencies since you have a capacitive load, is not as easy for estat amplifiers. So there's different techniques and methods used to design estat amplifiers, each with their own merits. So I do encourage people not to be kind of dismissive of the fact that amps do make a large difference, especially with estats. The other aspects of it is protection and safety for your headphones, and then of course the power and volume. So there can be a large variance in the amount of power and volume different amplifiers can deliver for estats as well. So here I am ABing a EHA5 by topping. It's about a $300 amp versus my hand-built KGSSH-V, which is a solid state amp. And I basically have a audio source, which is a FiO M11, going to a splitter that's now sending a single end audio signal to this KG amp, and then the EHA5 at the same time. And what I had to do was connect it to my DSP ears, play a tone with my audio source, and adjust the volume so that the sound pressure level at a certain tone is exactly the same. That way I can be sure that they're both at the same volume, because that's going to have a huge impact if I'm just trying to adjust the volume by ear versus actually measuring it to make sure that they're the same, to give it a more fair A/B. I'm measuring it with the Hive X. This has been measured by third parties. It has distortion levels that are below the noise floor. I mean, it can't be measured. So at all frequencies, so it's a good of a transducer as any of the Pro estat transducers to listen to. I'm listening for major differences in sound, and I'm gonna play a variety of music. So right now you can hear it is playing through the EHA5. So I'm gonna unplug it and plug it into here and just do that kind of back and forth. I need to give it a couple of seconds to charge up as I connect and disconnect, because I know that the levels just kind of rise slowly as after I plug it in, because it takes, for estats, it takes a second, at least for the Hive, it takes about a second or two to really charge the diaphragm. So I got to be cognizant of that. But the idea is just to switch it back and forth and see if I can hear any sound differences. So I've been listening for a while. I'm going to listen to just a variety of music with the highs, the lows, trumpets, different levels, because I'm really just trying to find any subtle difference in what I can hear at a comfortable listening level. I'm not going to try and push it to where it's going to hurt my ears to see if I can find a difference. Then I'm not going to try and do crazy stuff. I'm just listening at a normal, comfortable listening level, and trying to see if I can find any differences. So I listened to both amps with my headphones on my head, obviously, and I really couldn't tell the difference between either of them at those normal listening levels. The correct way to do this would be to put a black box over it, do a double blind study, probably even isolate the inputs so that no one can argue that there's going to be some interaction between the inputs, even though I don't think there would be. Even then, they sounded exactly the same, so it didn't make any difference. But you want to do it in a very professional way and be able to kind of remove any doubt. That doesn't really mean that any amp is better than the others or like everything is bullshit or this or that. It doesn't at all. These are totally different technologies. They have different limitations. So one of the first amps I was looking at is this one, which is the SRM1 MK2. It's like a 90s stacks amp, and you can see those big resistors there are essentially resistor current sources. And the KGSHV is using actual current sources, and this amp is using transformers with the little small amplifier internally driving some transformers. So the technology and the way they solve the problem is totally different. Now, from a listening perspective, I couldn't tell the difference, but that doesn't mean from an engineering perspective there are things to be discussed and things to be talked about. Okay. There are also considerations as far as protection for the headphones and different things and all kinds of stuff to talk about. From a measurement perspective, they both had sufficiently low distortion as measured with the audio precision and a flat frequency response. So and the distortion I measured across highs and low frequencies. So I wouldn't have expected to hear any differences in normal listening levels. Now, both of these amps are definitely superior to, in my opinion, something like the SRM1 MK2 that uses resistor current sources, because you can measure it and see. So here's a 10 kilohertz sine wave going in, and an output at 180 volts is super distorted. I mean, it should look like a sine wave. And here's at 20 kilohertz what happens to it on the EHA5 MK2. And you can see when you lower the level a little bit, it gets a little bit better at 20 kilohertz, but you can see the huge distortion. That will sound very, very harsh. And so the way that the reason why these DIY amps exist and why this amp exists is to improve the current capabilities so that you get a good response. Here, this is at 10 kilohertz. Again, even at 10 kilohertz, SRM1K2 couldn't, is introducing a lot of distortion. The thing is, when people measure these amps, they only measure at 1 kilohertz. But the higher you go, the harder time they will have producing good distortion. And so here is, the same thing. This is at 20 kilohertz. You can see that it looks pretty good. And then here it is. Here's the topping at 10 kilohertz. It looks fine, which is expected from a transformer box. The transformer boxes are going to have more issues at low frequencies, but the issue at low frequencies is not going to be necessarily distortion. It's going to be like, it's either going to have it or it's not. It's going to cut out completely because it's a small amp driving a transformer, and at low frequencies the transformer looks like a short circuit, and so it could just completely cut out. And so that's the disadvantage of these, is if you're just blasting really sub-bass music that has no highs, and so you can really crank up the volume and not hurt your ears and just listen to like 40 hertz and below, you will get this amp to cut out easily. You'll never get this amp to cut out, but you can to this. So there's definitely like a discussion about margin and things like that. And so when people ask like, is this amp as good as you can, is this gonna sound the same and this and that, it is a complicated question because it really depends on, am I talking from, are you looking for, a luxury item that has like literally, fully balanced inputs all the way through, like a super well regulated bias supply and this and that, or are you just looking do you not care about that stuff? And you know, are you the type of person that if it works, it's not stupid, you know? If that if that's the case, then this will give you, just in my opinion, as good of sound as anything. But there are limitations, but those limitations for most listeners you probably will never run across if you're careful and you're you know, just cognizant of what you input into this. You'll probably never run into those limitations, but and that might be worth it for, you know, the amount of price difference that you'd pay for something that's doing things, you know, quote unquote, the best way possible. So this being a solid state amplifier and this being basically a transformer box driven by an internal amplifier is essentially comes under its own levels of scrutiny, and that is around the transformers inside, really. So there's like 3 things you want to see. One is that the bias voltage coming out of this, the 580 volt bias pin, has a ballast resistor on it, and this one does. So it has a 3.3 meg ballast resistor to limit that current. I have seen other companies that do this sort of thing that have damaged headphones that they don't have that ballast resistor on there. So this one does. The other thing is you need some sort of protection on your transformer. They don't use output protection clamps. So like if the output voltage for whatever reason went ballistic and you'd want it to clamp and not damage your headphones. Now they do have input protection, meaning at the primary of the transformer, which should be proportional to the output, does have protection. So if they drive their somehow they drive their transformer too hard, it will clamp at the input, which then should mean that the output will also clamp, or the output will not see that voltage. So there's that. Now, one of the things that I wish that it was just added in anyway, add some output protection anyway, because it would just get rid of some of that doubt, and you know, it's cheap insurance essentially. But there's an email from Topping where they have said that they've done a ton of testing on it with all the different headphones, and they haven't been able to damage any headphones, and that their product works essentially. So I trust that, you know, but it would have just been nice to do that. The other is, you know, these guys have contributed a lot to the industry, and one of the things they do is they put 5.1K resistors at the outputs, and so this amp doesn't. So basically this is like a transformer directly tied to your stators of your headphone, which isn't, it's not, you know, how can I say this? It's not ideal, I guess. It's just not, you know, it doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy when you hear that. But Topping claims that, well, there's, you know, the primary and secondary winding impedance that should act as its own impedance, so it's not like you're, you know, tying it dead short. It does have impedance inherently in the transformer, which fine, they can argue that. So there are a couple of things that like introduce some you know, FUD into the whole aspect of transformer boxes. The other is like, is the transformer linear? Is it a good transformer? Well, you can kind of just measure the frequency response, see that it's flat. You can measure the distortion. So those are kind of measurable things that you can verify. Yes, the transformer is good. Yes, you're able to drive it from 20 to 20 kilohertz. Yes, you're able to listen to music and really try and push it to the limit and not see it cut out or anything like that. And so those sorts of things, that sort of margin analysis can be done to verify those things. So that's the only kind of drawback of these sorts of devices. But I mean, it's also, I think, like $400 or something, which is crazy cheap for something like this. So I really like it. I have nothing against transformer boxes as long as they're done well. So my final verdict on this is that I think this is a really good combination. Originally, I was a little disappointed because I expected a lot from Topping, and I thought originally they had like a $400 solid state amp, and then I found out it was basically a transformer box driven by an internal amplifier. But that totally makes sense in terms of how they were able to get the cost down. So from a measurement perspective, it measured pretty well. And then from a listening perspective, I personally couldn't tell the difference when A-Bing this against some of the best designed amps I have. So Honestly, like if you're looking for a gateway into estats or you're getting into it and you want to hear how they sound and you don't want to shell out the amount of money that usually costs to get you a certain kind of luxury in this space, and you're interested in the sound, then I think this is a really good deal, to be honest.